You know, Andrew, I've been thinking about the future of Chatsunami. I just don't know where it'll end up.
Don't you worry. I've got it all figured out.
Go on.
We need to think bigger, bolder. Each season, we end with an overarching story culminating in an epic budget-breaking battle.
So far so good.
I'm thinking Tai Chi ninjas, evil Chatsunami played by a flying jellyfish, a bald guy with a fan, and a giant podcast bot. The Pandalorians are gonna love it.
What?
And I've saved the best for last. A rebrand. The Legend of Andrew, the podcast. Hosted by yours truly. So what do you think?
I think it needs a little bit of work. Hello everybody and welcome to the second episode of Avatar Month. My name's Satsunami and joining me as the reincarnation of the Chatsunami host is none other than Andrew. Andrew, welcome back.
I've replaced Adam and you've got to deal with it.
Yeah, now I've got to send Adam this episode. He's gonna love that.
I'm sorry, Adam. It's the first thing that came to mind. I thought it was funny.
This is why he's not been back.
I drove him away. I'm sorry.
For legal reasons, that is indeed a joke, but how are you doing, Andrew?
I'm good. Feeling all right despite it's still winter here in Canada and it's very much showing it. It's cold, it's snowy, and it's generally unpleasant, but otherwise pretty good.
Yeah, sounds about right here as well. As of recording this, we've just got over a major storm which has pretty much knocked every single tree across every single path that I need to walk across, which I know sounds like a bit of a first world problem, but yeah, honestly, just glad that the weather is settling. Unfortunately, I am not a master of the elements. I cannot bend the weather to my will. Otherwise, I would be the most OP man in Scotland. And speaking of mastering the elements, of course, what a terrible segue. I apologise, Andrew. But yeah, today we are indeed going to be talking about a very special series in the Avatar franchise. That, of course, being the sequel to Avatar The Last Airbender, The Legend of Korra. Now, before we go on and talk about this series, is it safe to say that, see, on the surface level, this series has been met with mixed responses?
Yeah, it has. It's one of those where you knew that following from the original, it was always going to be a sense of concern and they're always going to cling to the previous show and always going to be like, you've ruined the legacy of the show I loved. And so there's always going to be people that weren't fans of it and people who became fans of it and some people who, not myself personally, but some people prefer it to the original Last Airbender.
Yeah, that is a wild take.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I can see it, but we'll get into that throughout the episode.
As you were saying there, last week we discussed the Avatar The Last Airbender series, which ran from 2005 to 2008, and it was about 4 years until we finally got The Legend of Korra. First on Nickelodeon, and then for the last season, I want to say, they decided to stream it online. Very, very interesting choice there, I'm not going to lie, but yeah, is it right in saying that the marketing for this, and I could be totally wrong here because as I said before, I never really watched Avatar The Last Airbender growing up. It wasn't until I met you in university and you and I were discussing it and you gave me the DVDs to watch, went away, watched it, loved it, and I had no idea about The Legend of Korra until you told me. But is it right in saying you had a similar experience with The Legend of Korra?
Yeah, I mean, as I covered in the previous episode, I had a huge history with Avatar Last Airbender. I was well aware of it prior to coming over to the UK because I'd had experience with it when I lived in Singapore, where it got released like a year in advance of the UK almost. And I was absolutely obsessed with the show. Yet, whilst The Legend of Korra aired on Nickelodeon in the spring of 2012, I didn't hear about the show until I think like fall, autumn of 2013 when my brother was talking about it. And I was completely thrown back. I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean there's an Avatar show that I was not aware of? And so I immediately kind of jumped online and found all the episodes and watched a huge chunk of them, and then just proceeded to watch the entire series during my time at university up until it finished in, what was it, 2014? December 2014?
Yeah, and I can confirm that because I was there for when Andrew watched The Legend of Korra. I was in the same room as you were watching it after finishing The Last Airbender. I have to say, the marketing, and again, I could be totally off kilter here, but I don't remember really hearing anything about it online. You know, even obviously as a casual viewer, I might not have been looking in the right places, but it seems quite interesting that although they promoted it probably the same as Avatar The Last Airbender, it's interesting to see that not as many people maybe not realised it came out, but you know, that way it's like it just kind of dropped and you're like, oh great, we've got a new Avatar series. See, going into it though, were you quite excited about it?
Yeah, I was, because having that sprung on me that there was a show like a Last Airbender follow-up show that I hadn't heard of and I immediately got to watch, it was very exciting. And upon watching that first season, it is phenomenal. We're going to get into it a little bit later, but that first season I thought was incredible. There's downsides, there's negatives to it, but for the most part, I was absolutely in awe of this show. And then going on to the later seasons, I still enjoyed them to a lesser extent, but I was always very keen to be up to date on each episode and each season, and I was always looking forward to the next one. Unfortunately, with the production cycle, I didn't have to wait long between seasons.
That is something that you and I were talking about before we came on to record this episode, that it is interesting that 4 seasons of this show came out between 2012 to 2014, which is quite a short period. Genuinely, I never really thought about it. I thought it was probably a lot more spaced out, because if you look at Avatar The Last Airbender, you've got that period between 2005 to 2008, you know, the 3-year gap, so about a year per season, whereas this, they just kind of, I don't know if this is because towards the tail end, and again, we'll get into this later on, that they were keen on just wrapping it up and they had it released online and everything, so maybe that contributed to it. And it's quite a bold move for them, especially for the story of this, to set it so late, and even 4 years later from when the original series aired, that it was still kind of fresh in people's minds. There wasn't really much of a gap between the 2 series, was there?
Well, I mean, there was 4 years, which for a young person like I was at the time, that's an eternity. That's like majority of high school. I started high school in 2007 and The Last Airbender finished in 2008. And so like I was a year into high school, and then I didn't know about The Legend of Korra until I started university. So there is a pretty big gap in that way relative to lots of other shows now that are coming out that have such huge kind of gaps in between seasons. And Western animation is not as notorious for this as anime, because anime will often have years and years between seasons, but it was still a pretty substantial period of my life that had no new Avatar content. You did have the comics, and unfortunately you had the M. Night Shyamalan movie come out in between that time, but there wasn't really anything else to kind of sink your teeth into.
And I'm sure people were so eager for The Legend of Korra after flocking to the M. Night Shyamalan film.
Yeah.
For legal reasons, that is a joke. And before I get lynched by the very avid Avatar fans in the audience, will we dive into what makes The Legend of Korra so memorable, as well as some of its pros and cons?
Yeah, definitely. Let's jump straight into it.
As always, we will be right back after these messages. Welcome to Chatsunami, a variety podcast that discusses topics from gaming and films to anime and general interests.
Previously on Chatsunami, we've analysed what makes a good horror game, conducted a retrospective on Pierce Brosnan's run as James Bond, and listened to us take deep dives into both the Sonic and Halo franchises.
Also, if you're an anime fan, then don't forget to check us out on our sub-series, Chatsunami, where we dive into the world of anime. So far, we've reviewed things like Death Note, Princess Mononoke, and the hit Beyblade series.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can check us out on Spotify, iTunes, and all good podcast apps.
As always, stay safe,
Stay awesome, and most importantly,
stay hydrated.
Welcome to my friendly game club where everyone is welcome. The podcast where we share, we play, we run and sing. Well, we don't run, but we do sing.
Hey kids, are you looking for a new favourite fortnightly video game review podcast?
Then boy howdy have we got the show for you.
We take a different game every 2 weeks and we review them just like a book club.
You can find us on all good podcasting platforms.
And some of the sketchy ones too.
Simply search for the Game Club podcast and join the club today.
So, Andrew, do you want to take the absolute honour of summarising what The Legend of Korra is about for the Pandalorians listening?
for sure. So essentially, following the death of our previous avatar, Aang, at the ripe old age of, I think he was 60 something, or in reality 160 something. He was reincarnated, his spirit was reincarnated into the next avatar in the cycle, which was a waterbender girl called Korra. And Korra, we kind of get a big kind of jump in time from the initial scene where we see her as pretty much a toddler who clearly has already had some kind of experience moving the elements at that age, kind of showing that she is definitely the Avatar and also is an insight into who she is as a person. And it immediately jumps to her as a 17-year-old girl, really keen on fighting. So we're getting a very different kind of Avatar to Aang, who is very much about peace and avoiding conflict. And Korra is very keen to fight, very in your face, very cocky and full of her kind of ability to bend the elements, all but one. And so we are introduced to her. She leaves her kind of sheltered lifestyle that she's had, where she's been raised kind of in a bubble almost to protect her and to bring her up through this avatar training. And she goes to the big city where she's enlightened as to what the rest of the world is like. And whilst the world has improved since the 100 Years' War and the legacy of what Aang has done, there are still issues in the world. And she's trying to sort of figure out what her place is in this new world and how she can still be this kind of important figure whilst also understanding that there are new systems in place that make it so that she is not required anymore. And so she kind of gets embroiled in a lot more of the political end than what we ever saw in The Last Airbender. And we get this very interesting kind of examination of what life is like for people who don't have bending and how they kind of feel like they are treated as lesser humans, which is very kind of interesting, that very briefly gets kind of touched upon in The Last Airbender with one of the main characters, Sokka, but it doesn't really get examined in that same way. And then following the pilot season, we then move on to our next one where Korra is dealing with kind of a more spiritual world and figuring out how she, who has previously struggled with the spiritual side of being the Avatar, how she reconciles with the spirit world and how she understands more about the Avatar cycle and who the Avatar is, what the Avatar is, how the Avatar came to being, and understanding that side of things. And we then move on past that season into one where we have more airbenders in the world now, following the events of what happened in the second season. And we have an evil airbender who leads this elite group of very scary element benders to try and sow anarchy in the world. Each villain so far seems to have a very set ideology. You can not necessarily empathize, but you can potentially sympathize with what they're pushing and what their arguments are, like trying to bring down systems of monarchical government and trying to combat authoritarianism. And so Korra is balancing how you can't just unsettle the world in this way whilst also trying to understand that yes, there is balance that needs to be kind of had there. So that's very interesting. And then we pass that season, we move on to a more approach of to what the opposite of that would be. This authoritarian kind of rule is now taking over the Earth Kingdom, and how as the Avatar she needs to kind of combat what that is and kind of sows in familial relationships and friends separate and are at odds with each other, which then culminates in a very bizarre robot battle. And yeah, we kind of get lots of different relationships in the show, which we don't really see as much in The Last Airbender. It's a much more mature show, and so they kind of utilize that with some of the action, the deaths in it, subject matter of relationships, and again the ideologies that we're talking about, and even just mental health gets broached in a kind of a way that would not be touched on in the Avatar world. And then we also kind of very lightly, they still have their kind of restrictions from their Nickelodeon overlords, they talk about sexuality. And so you do get over 4 seasons of Korra, quite a mix match of different kind of storylines and ideas and ideologies, which is a very different approach than what you get from The Last Airbender, where it's all just under this one same goal of stopping the Fire Nation, restoring balance to the world.
No, I think that's a perfect summary. Thank you all for listening to this episode. No, you bring up an interesting point there, because each book of Korra relates to a particular ideology. As you were saying, the first season relates to the idea of inequality and the discussion about people who can't bend being, exploited versus the people who can bend. It is a very interesting topic, and again, we'll go into these a lot more in depth later. Season 2 has that side of spirituality. Season 3 has the idea of the pros and cons of anarchy. Believe me, I have a lot of thoughts about that one. And the last one deals with an authoritarian regime. So they're a lot more mature in a way. Sometimes they're handled really excellently, and then other times I feel as if they could have been better. But it is interesting to see them not only shift shift away from what Avatar The Last Airbender did, where they had basically the overarching plot of Aang needs to learn the elements and he needs to defeat the evil big bad. That was it. That was his job done. And obviously there's a lot more nuance in between episodes and things that happens, but that was essentially it. That was his quest line. Whereas for Korra, it almost feels as if every single season they have to have a big bombastic finale with every season. It's an interesting approach. I don't know how much I agree with it right enough, but again, we'll definitely go into that. But before we do and dissect this series as a whole, I'm quite curious to hear what you think about the setting of this show. So initially in The Last Airbender, it was very much a kind of
feudal.
Yeah, feudal. I don't want to say journey to the west, but like a fantasy land where technology was slowly developing. You had the Fire Nation that was just developing things like tanks and other weaponry, but overall it was very much in the past. It was very mystical. Whereas in Korra, they skip ahead 70 years from when that took place, and they set it in 1920s New York, don't they?
Yes, it does very much give that kind of setting.
Yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
I would not normally be that interested in what they have done with the setting. However, I do think they dealt with it in a very interesting way. The kind of idea of we were seeing technology rapidly increasing towards the latter end of the 100 Years' War, more so with, as you said, the Fire Nation and also other nations who were kind of developing war-related technologies. We had like the submarines that were fighting on the Day of Black Sun, and we have, you said, the tanks, and we had the giant metallic blimps and the drill, which is just absolutely crazy technology. So there was a bit of a mixed match there. You would get things that developed very late in our own universe's history, but they didn't have something like a gun, for example. And so it's interesting what the writers pick and choose with how technology develops and the utilization of it. This new season, they have motorized vehicles, they have cars. It makes sense in many ways that following the end of the 100 Years' War, when you have all four nations kind of living together, and particularly in this example of Republic City, which is where the majority of the show is set, it is kind of this neutral city where all nations come together and live together, as opposed to living in their respective nations. And so you have them utilizing a firebender's use of electricity to be able to power things. You have earthbenders doing developments with buildings, and the police who've learned metal bending can essentially swing around like Spider-Man or like Attack on Titan. And you have all these different groups and industries that are developed as a result of that. And so you kind of see how potentially within such a short period of time of the, as you say, this 50 to 60 years following the end of Aang's kind of era, how it has developed into this world and how society has progressed in such a rapid and familiar way. So I like it. I thought that there's a scene in season 1 where they can't all ride on Korra's polar bear dog. And so one of the characters, Asami, suggests that why don't we get in my car? And so they all jump in this car. And so you have Team Avatar bending elements while blasting down the street in like a hot rod. And it's pretty cool. They utilize their bending to make a tight turn and make a ramp and all those kind of things. So it's pretty cool how they are able to place what is essentially their magic system in a semi-modern setting.
I have to say, I think a lot of people seem to be put off initially that they were just diving into the deep end, even with the intro. It's like, when they try to break some really bad news, but they get someone that you like to break the bad news. So it's like, here's J.K. Simmons to tell you that Aang's dead and we're 70 years in the future. And then he discusses about New Republic City, which was, of course, established after the fall of Ozai's reign and everything. So it was interesting to see that and how this world has, I don't want to say naturally developed, but as you said, that they really utilise the bending with this world. Granted, it's a bit deflating to see benders who have these amazing powers working a 9-to-5 job. I know that they would probably be doing that in The Last Airbender. But yeah, it's kind of deflating when you see, Mako and things like that go into a factory to shoot lightning out his hands, and that was a power that was considered really frightening and a very terrifying thing in that time, and now it's kind of been reduced to, oh right, this is your 9-to-5 shift. But you can see why it's shifted to that. Yeah, you're right, they do utilise the bending within this world really well. One of the things I absolutely loved was the triple threat triad. I thought that was absolutely incredible. You had a mix of the three main bending styles, because obviously
There weren't any airbenders at the time.
there's a reason it's called the Last Airbender. I mean, there's a few, but we'll get to that.
You just have little Milo just flipping an old-timey watch, wearing one of those like long suits and long hat next to these giant other benders.
Hey, we got a wise guy here. Shoot to kill. No, Milo, please spare them.
Crime life's a breeze when you're an airbender.
I'm just thinking it cuts to like this horrible shot of them brutally beating someone, and it's just him farting over. And you're like, what were they thinking? And if you think I'm exaggerating on that last bit, trust me, we'll sadly get onto that. It's one of my least favourite parts of this show. But the setting I think is really cool. I do find it interesting as well that there's a lot more of a political slant on it in terms of the way that the governments interact with one another. You know, it's, as you were saying, it's not just like isolated blocks anymore, squabbling over land and such. It's more that they're all kind of trying to work together in this one city, and they're worried about silly things like approval ratings and what's the best PR move, and trying to use companies for their own benefits. Again, it is something that I didn't really think I'd be asking for, but it's something that fleshes out the world, and I do think that, you know, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it does, but I think overall it works once you put aside the fact that this is no longer Aang's time, because that is something that is very hard to deal with, where the first time we meet Korra, she is a child, and I mean a literal toddler, and she's screaming, I'm the Avatar, you've got to deal with me, or you've got to deal with it.
Which is the line that I got Janet Varney to write on my Blu-ray copy of The Legend of Korra.
Really? Wow.
I felt bad. I even said this to her. I was like, I know you technically didn't say that line. It was like another actor that said that line, but it's still like the iconic line for me. I like it, and it feels very much what Korra is. So I still asked her to sign that.
Was she just shaking her head disapprovingly, like, I swear to God, these Avatar fanboys?
I was very starstruck when I met her and Dante Basco. I've seen other celebrities before, and I've never been as starstruck and lost for words when I was talking to anyone as I was when I spoke to those two. It was so overwhelming and embarrassing. They were so lovely. They're such a pleasant two people to chat with, and they very much took the time to have a conversation when I was seeing them.
See, while we're on that topic, can we just shout out the voice cast for this show? You know, as you said, we've got Janet Varney as Korra, we've got J.K. Simmons, the absolute legend himself, as her mentor and son of Aang, of course, Tenzin. We've got a whole, surprisingly, like a really good cast of voice actors here. I think Dante Basco even makes an appearance later on, does he not?
Yes, Dante Basco plays Zuko's grandson.
Oh, so he does, yeah.
He's called Iroh, General Iroh, or Admiral Iroh or something. And so the prince twice removed, I guess, because his grandfather Zuko is still Fire Lord, and so he won't be Fire Lord for a little bit yet, if at all.
I completely forgot he voices Iroh, because I was thinking of Zuko, and I'm like, yeah, I remember Zuko makes a cameo and he's in it for a little bit, and I was like, oh yeah, General Iroh. Yeah, no, the cast is absolutely fantastic in this show. Honestly, I don't think there's really anybody that I would say did a poor job, and this is something we talked about last week when we were talking about the characters that we thought, I don't know. Is there anyone in particular you would say that maybe wasn't as strong?
I don't know. I think that for the most part, the main cast are all very good. There's a few that are like amazing, and that's the worst thing that I could maybe say about them, that they're like okay. David Faustino, who plays Mako, he does an okay job. I wouldn't say that he blows me away, but I don't think the character himself blows me away, so I don't know necessarily that's David's fault there. But it is interesting that you have a very stacked cast of celebrities, both voice acting the main cast and also just kind of recurring characters as well throughout the series. That you have Clancy Brown in this, you have Steve Blum in this, you have Daniel Day Kim, which is quite funny because he plays Hiroshi Sato in this, and he also plays Firelord Ozai in the Netflix Avatar.
Ah, cool.
You have Aubrey Plaza for second season, and maybe some of the other, maybe she comes back in some of the others, but I think in much more of a minor kind of context. Steven Yeun has a brief stint as Avatar 1, the very first Avatar that you see over 2 episodes, maybe a bit more. People might know Steven Yeun from Invincible. He plays the main character in Invincible. He was in The Walking Dead. He's done a few other things, but those are kind of the two that most people know known for. Greta Lyle makes a comeback very briefly in this. People know her as the voice of Azula. She comes back to play Ming Hua, who I think was one of Zahir's kind of underlings. I think she was the waterbending who didn't have arms.
Yeah, I think you're right in that.
You have Alison Stoner, who's quite well known. You have Zelda Williams in this. I'm sure there were others that kind of came to mind. Mindy Sterling's another big one. People might know her as Frau from Austin Powers. Oh yeah, and Seychelles Gabriel, who's Asami Sato, played Princess Yue in the M. Night Shyamalan Avatar, which is quite funny.
Yeah, I was going to mention that one. Huge shout out for getting back into Avatar unscathed. Sorry, relatively scathed given the film. But yeah, no, that was a really surprising one, I have to say, when I was looking up the cast and I was like, well done for her.
It would be wrong if I didn't mention D. Bradley Baker as well, who returns from his many roles within The Last Airbender to play again several roles in The Legend of Korra. People might know him from literally everything you've ever seen cartoon, video game wise. He voices so many things. But in Avatar context, he was all of the animals that you hear. He did the noises of Appa's grunts, Momo's little chitters, any kind of hog monster things you hear. It's usually D. Bradley Baker doing them. And so he also does Naga, the polar bear dog, Pabu, the cute little fire ferret, Oogie, who is another sky bison. And then he also plays Tarlok, who is one of the villains of the first season. So he has quite the coverage in terms of cast and crew of the show.
Yeah, I feel as if there's any Western animation out there, he just appears like a moth to a flame. It's just like, can I get a role in anything? He eventually gets it and you're like, actually, fantastic work here. But yeah, you're right. In all seriousness, the whole cast does an absolutely fantastic job. I honestly can't think off the top of my head anyone who I went, I don't know, or that was a choice. Because they definitely lean very much into, as I was saying before, this whole city is very much a 1920s New York-esque town, and a lot of characters lean into that. In particular, there's one who is essentially, he's a bit of a con man, but at the same time he's just so much fun to watch. That, of course, being Varric, played by John Michael Higgins. And he very much doesn't he just leans into the whole, I'll tell you what, sunshine, and da-da-da. Oh, that's the other thing. I can't remember who does the narrations.
Yeah, Jeff Bennett. Yeah. He's pretty prolific within the voice acting world as well. He was in like Gargoyles and Dexter's Lab and hundreds of things. He's very well known.
Oh god, I absolutely love see his recaps. It's like previously on Avatar, and then they go on. So damn good. But speaking of previously on Avatar, let's talk about the characters after establishing that they are voiced absolutely fantastically there. What are your thoughts about the new Team Avatar? Were you sold on them when you watched them in the first season, or did you think, I don't know?
I was intrigued by them. I loved Korra. I thought that she was very cool, and they dealt with the change from Aang very well. Instead of trying to copy and paste what you had before, you have someone who's very different and like still comes across as what an Avatar canon should be, but takes it in a very different way from what Aang is like. She has her annoying moments, but she's 17 years old. Of course, she's going to be a bit annoying, make some bad choices. That's what we were all like when we were in our teenage years, even now. What's quite interesting about this, and I was saying this to my partner when we were watching it, is that we are introduced to the complete Team Avatar, and like they're essentially all assembled together as a team who are fighting against injustice by episode, I think, like 4 or 5 of season 1, whereas you don't get Toph until I think like episode 4 or 5 of season 2. You don't get Zuko joining the group until I think episode 12 of season 3. And so in 5 episodes, you have what is essentially the complete Team Avatar, albeit there's some other characters introduced later that kind of come and go from the main team. I suppose The Last Airbender, where that was 50 episodes in? Pretty much it's 10 episodes from the end of the show by the time that we have our complete team, which there's arguments for and against that. You get that slow build, that redemption story from Zuko. You kind of have the back and forth playing of the different characters from The Last Airbender with Toph and Katara at odds and that kind of thing. So a lot of interesting kind of ideas there, and Korra might kind of speed into that a little bit, and then there's some kind of clumsy kind of play with relationships. But you are introduced to our characters characters. You have Mako and Bolin, two brothers who interestingly control different elements because they have a parent from each side of nations. They have a firebender and an earthbending parent. So they kind of have it split between them, which is very cool. They're introduced as these martial combat fighters, and then you kind of introduce this new sport to us. And so we kind of are brought into the world with them, and they act as the serious one who's a love interest for Korra, and the more comical one who we're supposed to kind of at times feel sorry for, other times think like, oh, he's gotten too big for britches and then he's becoming a bit of a jerk kind of thing. And then you have Asami, who looked, I don't know about you from the first season, but looked like she was going to be a villain. She has a lot of the characteristics, and her story arc suggests that that's where they were going to go. There's a lot of aspects where you're like, oh, I don't trust her. The kind of convenience of her appearances and her decisions, and sometimes you'll see glances where she clearly doesn't like that her boyfriend Mako and seems to be interested in Korra, knowing that Korra is interested in him. You have a storyline where you kind of expect her to be an antagonist that never actually pans out, and she is arguably one of the most level-headed characters in the entire show.
I can't disagree with that. Yeah, this is quite an interesting entourage of main characters, I have to say, because although I think they're initially introduced quite well, obviously Korra's exempt from this, but I feel as if Mako and Bolin are quite, I don't want to say bland, but they are a little bit milquetoast, aren't they? I don't know, they have some funny moments and things, but Mako, I think especially, is very much just like a blank slate firebender. Bolin's just like the class clown. Asami, there is honestly not much going on there character-wise. As you said, a lot of people, genuinely a lot of people have said that they thought in the first season she was an equalist and everything, and then it's like, oh, father, I didn't realise you had a warehouse under the mansion. And I'm like, what?
I thought she was bluffing and that she would. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that the expectation of that was not met, because it subverts that. And I'm usually a big fan of subversion of expectation when it comes to show, and particularly with comedy, but just in story writing. I think it is good to do that for a lot of things because it keeps you on your toes.
Absolutely. But yeah, I feel as if maybe, and again, this isn't really that fair because I'm comparing it to The Last Airbender, but you're completely right. With The Last Airbender, we had the cast kind of slowly built up. You had Toph in season 2, you had Zuko in the third season finally joining the gang, and for this they kind of just lump them there and say, okay. It kind of feels like that is a minor issue with the show, that it likes to rush through the wrong things. And again, there's an argument for and against here, but for Korra herself, the only thing that she can't really master is airbending, but she masters all the other elements, which I know a couple of very vocal fans were against, that, oh, how is she picking these up? But on the flip side, she was trained by the White Lotus and everything. So, or even before that though, I think maybe it's because she came out as a toddler, bending all the elements, but even then, as you said, you don't want a copy and paste of Aang, otherwise people would be a lot more moany about it. The one thing about Korra's character that I really don't like is that I think they write her as a teenager too well. I don't know how you feel about this, especially for season 2 and bits of season 1, where she throws mini tantrums in the middle of really serious events. They have the whole love, I was going to say love triangle, but it's not a love triangle. It's pretty much a love square, isn't it? Eventually it turns into a triangle, but Bolin was in there for an episode or two.
Actually, the Korra, Asami, Mako situation, quite literally, is the only example I can think of within fiction that is actually a love triangle. I don't think, because love triangle is used so often and it doesn't make sense for the most part, because the love triangle means that each person would have a relationship with the other, when in fact in most cases it's like a love arrow. There's no bottom connecting section where two people of what is in this situation the same gender are dating, whereas in this you have Asami dating Mako, Korra dating Mako, and then Korra dating Asami, and so you have an actual triangle. You do have Bolin very briefly wanting to be with Korra from when they very first meet, he develops an immediate kind of interest in her. But Bolin as a character always seems to be kind of chasing girls. He seems to have kind of a real interest in finding a girlfriend. For the most part, it does not work out for him. He has a lot of misses. He tries to start a relationship with an actress that isn't really interested in him back. He is kind of forced into a relationship with a daughter of the chief of the Northern Water Tribe, played by Aubrey Plaza. Keeps him almost like a pet.
Yeah, that wasn't a great highlight, I'm not gonna lie.
No. And then he meets a very sweet girl called Opal, who he feels like he's more himself with. He's not trying to play up a character with her. He's just kind of his goofy self with her. And it's very kind of sweet to see that is where he's at. That relationship itself does take some turns and ons and offs, but ultimately that's kind of his ending point with her, which is nice to see. Mako ends the series with kind of a bromance where he and the Earth King have like this very odd
Emperor's New Groove coded relationship.
Yeah. Like, there is almost like a boyfriend-boyfriend relationship about them in many ways, but it is also essentially a case of he is his bodyguard. You have Prince Wu as this pathetic individual that is constantly sort of jumping into Mako's arms to protect him. It becomes very gay-coded in the 4th season, both with that sort of relationship and then at the very end with Asami and Korra. There's a lot of hinting at that, if not actually doing it.
No, Andrew, they were just roommates, come on.
And they were roommates.
I have to admit, I completely gaslighted myself when I was rewatching this series, because I was convinced at the very end when, in spoilers, Asami and Korra get together, that they hold hands before they go into the spirit world and then they kissed. And I was convinced that was a scene. And then when I was watching it on Netflix, they turn to one another, they hold hands, and then they just disappear, it fades out, and it says the end. And I was like, that was very, very tame. Like, I know what they wanted to go for the show, but clearly a lot of higher-ups would only let it go that far. Hand-holding. The lewdest form of contact.
Well, yeah, it is funny you were talking about that kind of Mandela effect of the Korosami kiss. I think I had that in my head as well, that was a scene. I think it was because the show writers said they wanted to do that, but they weren't allowed to. They didn't even actually declare feelings for each other. It is very much just implied that they enter a relationship with each other.
Yeah, personally, and again, I could have been missing the signs entirely, but I didn't feel as if they really hinted at it until season 4, and then they overtly hinted at it with, Korra blushing when Asami compliments her and she's the only one she's been talking to, that kind of thing. It feels as if, and again, there's obviously more complex elements to this. It's not just a case of why didn't they put it in season 1 or whatever, but you can definitely tell it was like the last season they thought, screw it, this is the way we're going, and good on them, but it did feel kind of rushed that it just kind of popped up, unless I'm missing something with that.
No, I think they had wanted to. My understanding is season 4 actually didn't air on Nickelodeon. It aired digitally on Nickelodeon's digital platform because Nickelodeon lost kind of faith in the show for a younger audience. They didn't really like a lot of the mature stuff that they were going for. Despite the fact, I think that Legend of Korra was performing as one of its best shows at the time. Like many other more mature cartoons, they didn't really see much of a toy selling appeal to it. They didn't feel like they could really make much money from it other than just from viewing numbers. So they shifted it onto digital platform. And so it was at that point that they had a bit more freedom to be able to have those moments that they could insinuate that, whereas they couldn't before. That is my understanding, at least. I might be wrong, that they had not planned for a kind of Korosami thing prior. But my understanding is that the network television chained them to what they could and couldn't show or imply. And when they didn't have that anymore, they had a little bit more freedom.
And I mean, especially back in 2012 to 2014, I assume it probably would have been a bit harder for them to propose that and get something more overt, as it were. Not that you needed to have that, but at the same time, yeah, it feels as if it kind of comes out of nowhere in season 4. It's cool that they did it, but at the same time, you're just like, oh, okay, fair dues.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the very earliest kind of representations of a gay relationship was essentially children's media. And so it very much laid the groundwork for what was then able to be achieved from lots of other cartoon shows that you had, for example, like Owl House, that has a very overt gay relationship, and that you have kissing in those shows. There's several other kind of examples. I'm afraid I'm not as up to date anymore with young people shows.
We are hip and cool, I
swear. But that you can have what is now being titled as being woke kind of content, that you're able to have that without it being aggressively censored. And you can get into a completely different topic about the culture war around that and how finally being represented on media, and now lots of people are claiming like, oh, it's everywhere now and you can't get away from it, when in fact it's just like almost a compensation for the censorship from the previous decades.
And that is next week's episode. No, moving on from that and into, before we talk about the main story, I just want to touch on and see what your thoughts are about the legacy characters of the series, in particular the descendants of them. So, you know, you've got Toph's children, you've got Aang's children as well, Zuko's nephew, I want to say. So you've got Tenzin, you've got Chief Beifong, General Iroh, you know, you've got all of these characters that are more or less descended from the characters from The Last Airbender. So before we move on to talk about the story, because I feel as if that's the meaty part of this episode, what are your thoughts on them?
You get a bit of a mix because, I mean, just touching quickly on General Iroh, he's the grandson of Zuko, and we don't really get that much of him. He's kind of just there and is cool, good fighter, army guy from the Fire Nation, kind of rocks up towards the end of season 1 to relieve some of the burden during the fight against the Equalists, and then we kind of get him here and there throughout the other seasons. He's fine. We don't see enough of him to really kind of get an idea of what he's like, that he has much personality. He is a bit wooden, but that's whatever. What were your kind of thoughts on him?
Yeah, he's serviceable. I feel as if he acts a little bit like Zuko, but without the acne eye treatment. He's just very, as you said, he's just kind of very there. And his voice, although Dante Basco does a great job, it is quite distracting when you're just listening to a future Zuko talking. You're like, yeah, that's definitely Zuko's relative.
Dante doesn't have another voice.
Yeah.
There's a lot of voice actors that will change up their voices for different kind of roles. This is not a criticism of Dante, but he has the Dante voice that he uses.
I was going to say, he's not called Dante Bradley Baker for nothing. Yeah, no, I think he's serviceable, to be honest. He's a good enough character, and I like it when he appears, but I think his introduction was excellent. But beyond that, yeah, he's just like a Fire Nation guy. For the other characters, though, Chief Beifong, I think she's great. I always like when she turns up and she's just metal bending the hell out of everything. You can certainly tell she's Toph's daughter. Tenzin, I do like, but I don't like his children, and I know that sounds absolutely terrible to say. Well, that's a lie. I think 2/3 of his children are all right, but you know the one, you know the one I really don't like, and that is Milo, because Tenzin, of course, he is trying to live up to his father's reputation, and it's quite interesting what they do with him, that he has this burden of responsibility. And of course, when you see his siblings as well, who one of them is a waterbender and the other's like a non-bender, until season 3 when shenanigans happen that we will touch on, that he becomes an airbender. So I like the family dynamic there and what it meant to be the son of Avatar Aang. But Milo Milo gives me like this indescribable rage every time he pops up, where he is obviously a child, I get that, but he constantly uses his airbending to like fart and things, and that is something that, again, that the show shouldn't be 100% serious, you can't have any jokes and things, but when you've got this rugrat lying around just farting in people's faces, I think he gets a little bit better. See, in season 4, when he grows up a bit, I don't mind him as much then, but see, before that, no, he's just very, very irritating. I don't know what your thoughts are in Tenzin's family for that, but
I think it's interesting. From Tenzin's children, you almost get 3 distinct personalities from Aang, and so it's almost like Aang's personality is kind of split in 3 with them. You have the kind of stoic monk side from Jinora, you have the frantic ADHD coded aspect of him in Iki, and then you have the kind of really goofy babyish kind of aspect of him in Milo. However, I do agree that Milo's scenes are some of my least favorite. I don't think necessarily that he's always a bad character or badly written, but he kind of adds this slapstickness to the show that is otherwise trying to be quite serious. And so I kind of wish that a lot of, and you referenced earlier where they're defending the Air Temple island from Equalists and he farts on one of them and he airbends his fart essentially to blast away one of the bad guys. That would have been fun from a different vibe of Avatar show, but Korra doesn't really give that. It feels a lot more mature and serious in many ways. You can have some humor and brevity to it, but you don't really need that kind of slapstick in it. He has other scenes which I kind of find him a bit annoying. There's an arc where he's a really good painter for some reason and he's hitting on this girl. He's generally just kind of an annoying character. He does have moments where I don't mind him, but I agree that he's probably one of the worst parts of the show.
I mean, is it bad that I was cheering for Amon in the first season when he was about to take away their bending and I was going, take Milos first, please, for the love of God, leave the others, take Milos.
What's quite an interesting dynamic, just kind of going back to Tenzin and his siblings, is that you were talking about this kind of burden that Tenzin has, that essentially Aang felt like one of his responsibilities, as well as being the Avatar, was to bring back the Air Nation through, even just in a small part, through his own family. And he succeeded with Tenzin in that Tenzin is an airbender. But the two other children that he had, Kaya and Bumi, the latter named after his good friend, King of Omashu, Bumi, they weren't airbenders. And so he almost felt like he'd failed in some way. And because he knew that he had to help Tenzin to increase his airbending abilities and teach him the ways of the Air Nation, those two were not necessarily ignored, but they weren't given the same level of attention and devotion from their father, which paints Aang as not a very good father, which is often a criticism held to the show, that someone like Aang would be selfish and self-centered in that way, that he wouldn't be a good father and love his children equally, which I don't think is necessarily what the show is saying. I think what it's saying is that that burden that Aang had was represented in having to both help bring balance to the world again following the war and also bring back his people. And so that unfortunately meant that his other two children didn't get that kind of air nomad education and that same level of attention. But I don't think that necessarily meant that he didn't love them as much. I can understand what people are saying in that criticism, but I don't think it necessarily means that. And so Tenzin carrying on that responsibility whilst also kind of being oblivious to his siblings' treatment took on that extra, I keep saying burden, that weight of trying to uphold his father's vision and his father's wish to bring back the Air Nation in a small way until we have harmonic convergence that brings back the Air Nation through just kind of giving random people airbending. I wonder if it was random or if people were selected by the spirits based on their own personalities and how that works within like an Air Nation context.
Actually, that is probably the best point to leap into the story, or rather stories of this. And as we briefly touched on before, there are 4 different ideologies that I feel as if each season tries to tackle. Now, before we go on, one of the things that I feel as if the show kinda does poorly, and I'm just going to put the firebending out there and risk myself, but I feel as if they try to deal with a lot of very, mature and complex themes, like, as we said, book 1, equality, book 2, the idea of spiritual balance, book 3, talking about taking down corrupt systems, and then book 4, we discuss the ideas of authoritarianism. I feel as if every season kind of starts the same way with their villains, where you see it from one side where the villains make a really good point about certain things, like, for example, with Amon, he's trying to literally equalise, as his movement suggests, between the conditions of element benders versus non-benders for season 2. It's about Unalaq trying to restore the spiritualness of his people.
Well, he says that.
Well, yeah, exactly. This is a problem I have, though. For season 3, you've got taking down corruption. Season 4, it's trying to rebuild from that. But I feel as if initially it begins good, and then obviously they have to slam people in the face and say, actually, these people are terrible, terrible people. I know they're trying to do that balance of, oh, they've got good points, but they're still a villain. I never feel as if that comes across great. It always has to be, oh, initially they have a good point, but then they're the most despicable person in the world.
It's one of those kind of things, like, I remember people would talk about this a lot with Black Panther, where you had Killmonger who was making some pretty justifiable points, but then you're like, well, we can't have the audience actually sympathizing with this guy, and so we have to show him strangling this woman and killing this other person and that kind of thing, to be like, oh wait, no, he is a villain, you're not supposed to like him.
I think season 3 and 4 especially are terrible for this. With Sagir, as we were talking about, he is very much driven by his ideology of everyone should be free and whatnot. Obviously, it's a bit of a very complex issue about the idea of anarchy versus keeping corrupt systems in power. And, initially you think, oh, you know what, this guy has a point. And then he literally sucks the air out of the Earth Queen, which is by far one of, if not the most brutal death scene that we actually see on screen for Avatar.
That's the thing as well. They show it. Like, they show what is one of the most brutal deaths you will see. Because we've never seen evil airbending, really. Not even evil airbending, because we only ever had one airbender before. But just the use of airbending in such an offensive capacity, that having this use of just drawing, like, you've had bloodbending, which was up to this point one of the most disgusting and vile things you could do to another person, that you're controlling their body. And then you have a nation of people who have control of the air we breathe and can just remove that from us. And that the implication being that thank God that they are peaceful monks, because they've had this ability forever, or at least since the lion turtles gave it to them.
I'm just imagining that conversation. Now, don't you go sucking air out of people's lungs. Just a here over here and like, that gives me an idea.
I was going to say, like, I wasn't gonna, but now you said that, I wanna.
That's an oddly specific thing to say, Lion Turtle. You'd be surprised. It's like, okay, fair enough. Don't know how we thought of that one, but honestly, A for both creativity and atrocities to humankind. Yeah, he's a monster. That's the thing. I feel as if towards the tail end, especially with season 1, let's go back to season 1 for a second, because I feel as if season 1 is by far the strongest, for me personally, the strongest season of the whole show, because we have someone who wants to rid the world of bending, and has this really interesting power that he can take away people's bending power, and that terrifies Korra. I found that really interesting, that up until this point, Korra, much like any teenager to be honest, she found herself very invincible, she could take on the world, and then she saw this never before seen power other than with Avatar Aang, that she thought, oh, hot damn, I don't want to fight this guy. It was quite fascinating to see, not only was he more than just like a mustache twirling villain, he was a smart villain. He got public perception on his side, he manipulated the system, he got in with the right people, to the extent that he took over Republic City for a brief stint. It was pretty impressive, I'm not going to lie. He's a horrible person. But then at the end, it's revealed that, and again, spoilers going forward, but that, oh, he's a bloodbender IRL, and you're like, oh, okay. What were your feelings about that for Ramon as a character? Did you feel as if him being revealed as a bloodbender was detrimental to the overarching themes of this book?
Retrospectively, I can see that argument. At the time, however, it was very much a, oh, damn, they did that. That's so cool. They've really kind of surprised me. I think that's really clever. And you then get that finale with the two brothers, who were essentially, both of our villains were brothers with each other, one of whom didn't know the other was his brother because he was hiding behind a mask. And then one kills the other, or rather kills both of them. Essentially goes suicide pact with the other person, a not willing participant.
Yeah, I actually forgot about that entirely. And then when I saw they were escaping from the boat, I was like, oh, I forgot they escaped. And then 2 seconds later, he brings out the electric gauntlet towards the fuel
gas.
line. Yeah, the gas. And you're like, oh, this is brutal. No more Ramon for the future.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Season 1 had that, which was like, oh, Jesus. Season 3 had the suffocation of the Earth Queen, and also the combustion woman blowing her own head off.
I think I said this last week, but I got her confused with the combustion man from The Last Airbender, because I was convinced he got metal wrapped around his head and then blew up his own head.
Last Airbender would not do that.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I was so confused. I was like, that is pretty brutal for The Last Airbender. I'm like, oh, yeah. It's Korra, of course.
Yeah, and then season 4 has
big robots.
Well, yeah, there is that scene with Kavira essentially committing her husband to death. He is actually saved in the end, but it looks like she has killed him with this like laser gun thing, which was going to be very brutal. I can't really think of much else from that, but season 2, I'm pretty sure there's nothing particularly brutal or devastating in that one that I can think of.
The thing is, with a lot of the seasons for this show, they all seem very self-contained. bad, which I find quite odd coming from The Last Airbender, because as I said, it was the overarching plot of Aang and the rest of his friends trying to stop the Fire Lord. You know, season 1, season 2, season 3, that was the story that they were carrying over. And although elements of each season of Korra carry over, it feels as if you can almost watch them, you know, relatively, except for season 3 and 4, that's different. But for season 1 and 2, you can kind of watch them as their own isolated thing, because, you know, you've got Amon in that one, and then they have to get a new big bad, and they get Unalaq in the second one, who becomes the evil avatar, which I hate that trope. I absolutely hate that trope when they take the hero's power and then they just say, oh yeah, what if evil version? Because I am sure Hunter x Hunter did a similar thing, and apologies for showing my weebiness off, but there was like a movie that they had where it was like the powers that they have, you know, this is a very brief summary of it, it's like the powers that they had called Nen. They had an evil version of that.
Nen in reverse.
It was like, no, genuinely, it was something stupid like that. And I remember watching it thinking, but we've seen people use that same power, but they've been incredibly evil, so what's the point of having an evil version? And the only highlight of season 2, I suppose, is the Avatar origin, but while I like that in terms of the way it's animated and how it delves into the lore, it feels almost unnecessary, and it takes away a lot of the mysticism, because I think one of the things that I talked about last week in regards to the spirit realm is the fact that all of the spirits were morally grey, bar a few exceptions. Like, some would lean towards being evil, some would be a bit more good, and some would just be doing their own thing. Looking at you, Library Owl, you know who you are. No, jokes aside, I apologise to Won Shitong, please don't write that in your library. But yeah, there was that kind of moral ambiguity there, but I didn't like how they decided to make it more black and white, where it was like, oh, we've got an evil spirit that gives you evil avatar powers, we've got the good avatar, you know. I didn't really like that side of it. I felt as if on the one hand it was interesting they explored that, but it also took away.
I guess you can argue the spirits in their nature are chaotic. Rava and Vatu, they're not good and evil, I don't think so. I think they are order and chaos manifested as spirits. But, oh no, he's the spirit of darkness. All right.
Fact checking at Chatsunami.
Yeah, no, okay. Yeah, you have Vatu, the spirit of darkness, and Rava, the spirit of light, in conflict with each other in like an eternal struggle. I agree. I think that it does remove the kind of moral grayness, ambiguity of the spirit world when you have such a clear-cut good and bad idea to it. And season 2, I think, is generally regarded as the weakest. I will say I did enjoy the lore and backstory of the Avatar universe, and the animation was very interesting during those, I think, 2 episodes. Season 2 is a very weird one because you get quite an interesting storyline in many ways of what is essentially, we touched on this with regards to what season 2 is about. A large chunk of it is a water tribe civil war. You have the north and south respective water tribes at war with each other. The Avatar, who is herself of the water tribe, and particularly, I believe she's a southern water tribe resident, which is the same place as Katara and Sokka are from. She can't choose sides in this conflict because there is an element of it that is about one trying to impose its values on the other, and so you can sort of act in a way to say stop that, let each group be individual. But it is complicated, and it is kind of seen from the bystander's perspective of the Avatar treating them very poorly. And so you have what could be such a brilliant storyline there that is not necessarily ruined, but it is affected by this other storyline that's ongoing about her uncle and the evil Avatar spirit. You could have had so many of these elements exist within this season that did not involve that. And then you had other kind of clumsy aspects of the season with regards to Korra and Mako's relationship.
Oh, that was the worst. See, out of all 4 seasons, I feel as if season 2 is the worst between those two. They're just constantly arguing with one another. And Korra comes across really unnecessarily aggressive in season 2. Just an absolute pain in the backside to everybody. It just seems very out of character.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the criticism people have of the character of Korra, I feel largely comes from this season. And the thing that happens at the end end of this season, not the harmonic convergence, that's separate, but the destruction of Rava, which breaks off her link to Apru's lives. And so she no longer can access Aang or Roku or Kyoshi or any of these kind of previous avatars. She is completely isolated, and she's almost restarted the avatar cycle in a very different way, that she is now the first of a new chain, that she can't rely on others. And so it means that we don't get what is a very fun part of the Avatar universe, which is having that kind of multi-generational kind of link in the Avatar state, which allows you to sort of utilize the power of your previous lives. That she does have a different version of that, but it certainly is not as interesting as it once was. And so breaking that connection is one of the main criticisms that I see online, that, oh, Korra sucked, she ruined the Avatar cycle, and the show is rubbish because it changes the kind of fundamental part of what Avatar is, which I understand that point, but I don't necessarily agree. I think that they take it in a different kind of way with it, and that's fine. But season 2, other than one character that we love very much that is introduced in season 2, other than Varric, season 2 is incredibly weak and should have really been taken in a different direction, even with some minor changes. There's a YouTuber that I watch called Hello Future Me. I think he's from New Zealand, and he often does video essays on why this portrayal of this character works, how you within storytelling utilize these kind of ideas, and brings examples of different stories, and within that he often will reference Avatar with that. And he's actually done a video essay that's like almost an hour long, and I've never once gotten through it. I'd often put it on before bed. It's quite a peaceful thing to listen to before I fall asleep, so I've actually never listened to the whole thing. But he breaks down how, if he was writing season 2 with the template of what season 2 is about, how he would write it in a way that would be a bit more digestible and that wouldn't quite break the world of Avatar. And like, despite the fact that I'm saying I've not finished listening to it, it is very interesting. I do recommend it.
And again, this is purely a hindsight thing, and this isn't coming from the point of view of a professional writer or anything like that, but there was a lot in that season that definitely weighed it down, and I can understand why people didn't like it. Even in season 4, when they do a recap episode, they actually make fun of it, and quite frankly, one of the funniest jabs at themselves when Varric is retelling his side of the story in recap form, and there's like this amazing cutaway gag where
they have the 4 villains.
Yeah, they have Amon, Zahir, and it's not Kuvira, is it? Or is there somebody else? I think it's just those 2 maybe, or there's a couple of them. And then it's Unalok that puts himself into the call, and they're just like, no, we're hanging up here. It is one of the funniest things ever, and it feels more like an outtake, to be honest, or just like a kind of improv thing. I don't know whether that is the case or not, but it is absolutely hilarious.
It's a bit like a bridge series, or a bit like, you know, the bloopers from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood.
Yeah, exactly. Because it doesn't feel very professional when you're listening to them say these things. You're like, really? But it is so damn entertaining. So I give it a complete pass for that one.
We'd referenced, I think maybe in the Avatar Last Airbender episode, about how Avatar is so good at recap episodes that you had the Ember Island players from The Last Airbender, which recaps the series so far in the form of these like acting troupe that are like really hammily going through what happened and sort of taking jabs at various kind of aspects of the show. And then in this, as you say, we have, I'd remembered it as one of the talkies that Varric has, that he kind of creates this movie where that happens. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's when they're having like that little group discussion and they're recapping it. Unfortunately, in my rewatch of Korra, I didn't get that far. I've seen it several times now and know it pretty well, but I do forget exactly how that scene goes.
Yeah, from what I remember, it's pictures of them that pop up, and it's like whenever they're talking, their one will pop up on the screen and all of the others kind of move away. It's honestly so funny, and it's the highlight of that episode, because I have to admit I nearly skipped that episode in the rewatch because it begins with like a very boring Mako and Bolin recapping their side of the story and the love triangle and whatnot, and you're like, oh god, here we go. So I skipped through those bits, but then when I got to the Varric bit, of course, you bet your ass that I sat down and watched it, and I was like, this is amazing, 10 out of 10. He definitely carries the show a lot, because I think the difference between someone like Varric, because I criticised Milo, and the one Milo fan listening out there will be like, how dare you, but the thing that I think works for him is, although he's quite funny and he's got a lot of humour to his character, especially when he's with his assistant Julie, Julie do the thing. He's got a sinister side to him as well as a side antagonist, and again, this technically contributes to the bloat of season 2, but it's like where he's purposely orchestrating false flag attacks on Republic City so that the Civil War will keep going, that he can sell certain weapons to either side, that he takes over Asami's company through force. He's a sleek-it guy, to borrow a Scottish word. He is a very sneaky guy, but at the same time, how can you hate him? He's so damn charismatic, and that is the problem, that he is so charismatic, he gets away with so much of it. I think he is a great addition.
He is such an interesting character because there is that morally grey aspect to him where he doesn't really seem to have much of a moral compass. It's very much what works for Varric, and he is kind of forced in the last season to build like a weapon that he then decides actually this is bad, and he gains a bit of a moral compass to try and stop her. It is still very much a Varric on Varric's terms kind of thing. You have this Julie character who, you mentioned the do the thing Julie, didn't you?
Yeah.
Is part of this catchphrase that he has that is not as iconic as it maybe could be because it isn't referenced really at all now, but at the time I felt like it was very much in the lexicon, at least from that kind of nerdy bubble. So he is very interesting and is such a bizarre character in fiction in this children's cartoon, that you have this kind of sleazy businessman that is out for himself, that is not a bad guy in many ways, but is very rarely a good guy.
Can't believe I'm quoting Wreck-It Ralph, but that just because you're a bad guy doesn't make you a bad guy. What I have to say is quite interesting as well as with the Julie's character is that, and granted it takes her 2 seasons to actually become a fully fledged character, but I really like how in season 4 she becomes more of an independent character. She's not like a tag along for Varric. She actually tells him where to go and everything, and pretends to work for Kuvira later only to sabotage her machine and whatnot. She becomes her own character in that way, and apparently in the comics, spoilers for the comics later on, but I think it's either the comics or the books that she actually becomes the president of Republic City, which is pretty cool. But she ends up, of course, marrying Varric and everything, and I do like the fact that they gave her more of a character rather than just her being punchline for Varric's hijinks, as it were. Yeah, going back to the overall stories though, I feel as if it's a very inconsistent series, isn't it? I feel as if for the most part a lot of the books start strong, even for book 2, they start off relatively strong, they have their strong elements, and then by the end of it, either it ends in Korra getting absolutely wrecked and bet up, which I feel as if happens a lot, and again, there's 3 books compared to 4, but I feel as if Korra gets really beaten up quite a lot in this show.
Far more so than Aang, and I guess it's kind of the nature of, again, it's this grittier, more mature show. You have a character that is more prone to a fight than Aang, who would rather avoid one, and so as a result, she gets into situations where she's bested. And so the roughest moment is certainly the start of season 4, where we're introduced to Korra in this grubby back alley underground fighting circuit, where she's essentially just earthbend brawling with someone, and she is not winning. She's just getting very badly hurt from this, that she's trying to cope with this severe mental illness that she's developed as a result of what happened to her in season 3, which was horrible, where she was largely kind of just tortured. And so she's now trying to fight through that in a very unhealthy way, and what she thinks is kind of a catharsis, but is just an unhealthy life. And it kind of results in this kind of relationship that she ends up having with Asami, where she doesn't feel comfortable talking about where she's at with Mako, Bolin, or anyone else, but she does with Asami, and that's kind of where that pen pal relationship develops.
It's definitely one of the heavier topics, because as you said, in season 3, at the very end, she fights Zahir and his cronies and everything, and they have such a terrible fight that he ends up, I don't think it's him in particular, is it? I think it's somebody else that puts the metal into her body.
Her blood. So they put like this form of mercury or something, and this metal is supposed to make her body fight back and trigger the avatar state so that they can kill her in the avatar state and end the cycle of the avatar, which is super messed up. Because of this horrendous torture she endures, as I said, affects her in such a horrible way. I think season 3 ends in such a depressing note. You have Korra in a wheelchair, just looking exhausted.
Yeah, because it's like meant to be this happy, and for obvious reasons, that's why she's sad, but it's meant to be this very happy and joyous occasion, and then it cuts to Korra, and rightfully so, she just looks absolutely defeated. It's a horrible sight to see your heroes in that way. And again, I'm not saying it shouldn't be shown, but it's not something you initially want to see. You want to see your heroes be triumphant and against all odds. So, especially for a kid show, and I know this is more aimed towards teenagers, it's quite unique that they're showing that darker side of the Avatar world.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's why Nickelodeon stopped wanting it to be aired on TV, that they kind of pushed it to digital, because they weren't comfortable airing that more mature topic. That mental health and mental illness is more so just not necessarily parodied, but it's almost like, oh, that's crazy Larry kind of thing in a cartoon show, and you don't really get an idea of actually what mental health issues are doing to people, which is fair enough. It's cartoons, a kid show, it's escapism, but having something that shows that is important, and it's an avenue for more discussion. I'm to be a father later this year, and once my child is old enough to watch these kind of shows, I'm very much going to encourage that we watch these shows, and we'll understand that there's likely going to be topics that are brought up that they say, what was that about? Why was she like this? And that helps to bring about those kind of conversations.
It's something that I brought up last week when we were talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender, that I think while that show tackles these kind of issues in an all ages type way, I don't think I can extend the same description to Korra, purely because, although granted they do it more in a teen and child friendly way, at the same time I don't know how comfortable I would feel if, I was showing it to, at this point in the podcast and in my life, it's a hypothetical Satsunami Junior out there, but if I was showing it to my child, then I would be hesitant to show, especially season 3 until they were much older. So I can see why they were a little bit hesitant to continue, and I'm glad they did continue with the show, albeit with a slash budget and forcing it to be on streaming services as opposed to their primetime slots. And I can kind of see that, because can you imagine watching the episode with the Earth Queen getting brutally killed, and then it's like, coming up next, iCarly. You just feel like, Jesus Christ, I don't think I want to watch that show anymore.
I think that season 3 was aired. I'm pretty sure it was only season 4 that was digital, but I might be wrong there. It might be that it moved to digital for both the final 2 seasons. But my memory is that because of how long it takes for these things to air in the UK as opposed to America, and I'm not waiting around while everyone else is talking about Korra to watch them, I had to find an American means to watch it. And so I never watched Korra airing on TV until actually I came to Canada, and I was at my wife's parents' house on the TV there. It was airing in syndication. But other than that, I hadn't watched Korra on TV. It just wasn't an option.
And I mean, especially when we were in university, because let's face it,
we didn't have TV.
It's not even that. I mean, other than that, obviously, I doubt there were many, well, maybe there were a few flats that were running Nickelodeon constantly. We had a lot more to worry about than that. But
in my first year, your third year,
yeah,
we did have that place that had a TV. It had TV included in the student halls of accommodation.
We were fancy, I just want to say.
But it was, our North American listeners, and maybe otherwise won't understand this, but it was essentially terrestrial TV, which means that it had a limited number of channels. It wasn't cable TV, it wasn't satellite TV, it was limited to a very select group of channels, and Nickelodeon was not one of those.
Yeah, it's usually like BBC, ITV,
Channel 5, Channel 4.
Yeah, E4, those kind of, the usual suspects, essentially. There was a very limited amount of channels that we got, and I'm not going to lie, I don't think our flatmates would have been happy if we commandeered the TV and decided to watch Korra and things like that. I think they would have probably been like, why are you watching that?
I don't know, when SpongeBob came on afterwards, I think they'd be all for it.
I mean, true. Out of curiosity, and obviously not naming names, but did you show one of our flatmates, Korra and Avatar? You invited me and another flatmate to watch the very first episode of Attack on Titan. I always remember that, and him absolutely hating it.
No, I didn't think that Avatar would be his vibe, so I didn't suggest that to the flatmate that you're asking about. I got our friend from the flat next door to us. She watched it. I actually lent her my DVDs that I've never gotten back.
This is a call out. I Never and so later. This is a call out to them.
This is why we did Avatar Month, just so I could
Call them
make
out.
a plea.
This is going to be the thumbnail for this episode if you've seen this DVD.
The DVD box set of The Last Airbender that I had was so beautiful as well. Like, it's such a shame. Now I have a Blu-ray one that has both Korra and Aang together. It's very pretty, very nice. It's Blu-ray, so it's much better quality. But that box that the 3 seasons of Avatar Last Airbender were in my DVDs was so gorgeous that I was so sad that I lost it. Well, that it was not returned.
You mean trapped in an iceberg under the water?
It may as well be. It's in northwest Scotland.
But going back to Korra, it was honestly quite an interesting experience, I have to say. See, as a kind of relatively closing point here, it was quite interesting to watch this with you at the time because, as I said millions of times, you had knocked at my door and demanded that I watch Avatar The Last Airbender. I, of course, complied because you had more DVDs on the way that you weren't going to let me go by without watching. And when I watched it, you know, it made us bond together as friends. Of course, we watched Korra, and especially when it was coming out weekly, that was something to look forward to. Granted, the final episode of it left a lot to be desired when they decided to go very Gundam Wing on them by saying, oh, we've got this huge cannon on the back of a train. How do we get this to Republic City? Oh, I know, let's make a giant robot, which, yeah, it seemed like a very weird choice, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well because, like, they had Varric, who's the chief inventor, engineer kind of person in this world, develop this laser technology utilizing spirit power. How he wasn't employed in the kind of robot development. Season 1 has these little kind of robotic type suits, like mech suits that the Equalists use. This is not like them. This is like Pacific Rim, Gundam Wing-esque, gigantic skyscraper tall robot. Like, Varric presumably would have been involved in this. They had Batar Jr. maybe, who's also an inventor, who was like Kavira's husband, that worked on them. But it does seem quite far-fetched, like a little bit of a jump the shark moment, that it feels like the writers just wanted to have a giant robot fight. Because, I mean, they had the giant spirit fight. It was like a spiritual mech in season 2. And I guess they wanted another one of those kind of big epic final battles. So they felt they had to go big with it. But I think even within the context of like the technology jumps in the show, that felt a jump too far. I think it felt out of place, and I wish they hadn't done that. There could have been other options other than the giant robot.
It's a very choicey choice, I'm going to say, in the nicest way possible. It feels as if, and again, this is something I have an issue with overall with Korra, where they always have to try and have a big bombastic ending for every single season. There's no real cliffhanger or no moment to breathe, no pun intended here. There's genuinely no time. It's like, all right, for the first season, I thought that was handled excellently. Amon had taken over the city, that public opinion had shifted towards him until they found out he was a bender, in which it changed back weirdly quickly. I know it's a kid show, but come on now. But I thought that was handled well. Season 2, for very good reason, that a lot of people really dislike that, because Korra turns into like a giant blue version of herself, or rather she protects herself in fights. Vaatu wasn't very good, but again, you know, it's this big bombastic light show. And then season 3 again is a bit more grounded, where, well, not grounded literally because they are flying about, but you know, they're fighting one another and it's more ideals clashing and whatnot. And then season 4, it is almost like good, bad, good, questionable when it comes to that, because again, Kavira seems to be a character that, although she's introduced in season 3, her whole motivations and whatnot, they just pop out of nowhere. And that's all right, you know, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it feels like a huge leap, as you said, where although we do have exosuits and things like that in this world, this isn't your stereotypical one. This is very much more in the realms of sci-fi, and it doesn't feel like a natural progression. And what I hate as well about that is the fact that there's not really a satisfying ending. You know, the robot just crashes through, and then Kuvira's just like, oh, okay, I'm going to fire this cannon anyway. And then they go to the spirit world, they have a back and forth, and then they come back out the world, and then she's like, it's okay, guys, the war's over. Wait, what? Yeah, the war's over, it's fine. And I know they continue that conflict in, I want to say, the comics again. There's like a remnant of the Earth Empire, or whatever they call themselves.
Something like that, yeah. I have that comic, I've read it, and yeah, so they do continue the Kuvira storyline in an interesting way.
Yeah, it feels kind of sad that we didn't get that resolution in the show itself, but I can understand why as well on the flip side, because they probably wanted to just end on a high, say, oh, we defeated Kuvira, and it's like, wow, that was a very quick conclusion. It's like, yeah, we just knocked over a robot and took her to the spirit realm, and yeah, everything's handy dandy. So again, if I'm summarising my thoughts overall for Korra, I don't think it's as bad as everyone says it is. At the time, I'll hold my hands up here, and I will admit I did not like Korra as much as The Last Airbender at the time. I still think that The Last Airbender is the better show out the two, but it doesn't mean that Korra doesn't have its great elements. I think Korra, and you made an excellent point there, that Korra seems to be personified by season 2 for a lot of fans, that they say, oh, she's terrible, she lost the Avatar set, like losing a set of keys, which is weird, that she's very aggressive and whatnot, but there's a lot of, obviously, context things for that, and I feel as if the good parts are overshadowed by a lot of these bad parts. Like season 2 genuinely is really bad, but it has got some really good elements to it, and it's the same with season 3 and 4. It's got its great elements, and then it's got its slightly rushed endings, it's got its bad moments, but I don't think overall that this is a bad show. I think that this is still a worthy successor to Avatar. Is it the way I personally would have envisioned it going? Probably not, but then again, I'm not a writer.
I was going to ask, do you have a particular vision for where you would have wanted a subsequent Avatar show to go?
Honestly, not really, because it's so hard to pinpoint how this world would naturally evolve. Because as we were talking about at the beginning of this episode, you have the Fire Nation with literal tanks against people who are practically throwing rocks at them. And metal bending at this point, it's only just being discovered by the likes of Toph and whatnot. So it's hard to see where it would have gone from there. On the one hand, I was initially quite disappointed that they had such a technological leap from the world of The Last Airbender to Korra, with the cars and with the robots and whatnot. But thinking back to our own history, it's probably not a major leap, because there have been, especially in recent years, there's been huge leaps in technology and inventions and whatnot. So it is plausible. I think a lot of the anger and maybe dissatisfaction with the series is just because it's not The Last Airbender, and I think that is a massive thing. But it's something you also touched on earlier. I think that if they did do a copy paste of saying, oh, she's just like Aang, and oh, she does this and that the exact same way, people would still be arguing regardless. And I think even, I could be wrong in this, you might be able to clarify, but I think when they showed this to test audiences initially, people were worried that the kids watching weren't going to like Korra, and they were nearly tempted to just cut Korra and make it more of a male lead, to which I think a lot of people said when they were watching it, no, this is a really good character, what are you talking about? Kids were loving Korra as a character. So it's interesting, especially behind the scenes, where this show could have gone, and as we said, there was a lot of turbulent development with it.
I just want to touch on that just very quickly. What was so interesting about the creation of this show is that season 1, they did want this to become a big show, the creators, but they had been given one season to tell a story, and I think, I might be wrong on this, but I think there might have been an idea that they were going to do a different Avatar story. There'll be like one season of like this Avatar, and then jumping to this Avatar and doing that kind of thing. But season 1 of Korra was so well received that it was greenlit for 3 more seasons. And so you can see the difference in quality in several ways, but for the most part in its animation from season 1 to the subsequent seasons, the quality does get worse in terms of the animation as seasons go on. There are exceptions to that. It's not that it's not a beautiful show. Like, it is a beautiful show throughout all 4 seasons of it. And we mentioned the Avatar 1 section being like a different animation and being very unique unique and beautiful. But season 1 of Korra was animated by Studio Mir in Korea, who had some work on the Last Airbender show, I believe. But this was a new project that they had been asked to work on by Nickelodeon, the creators of Avatar, that they were so burnt out working on it, because this was the most intensive show for frame animation that they had ever worked on. They slept in the office. Conditions were absolutely horrendous. What we got from that was one of the most gorgeously animated seasons of television that you will ever see. I will fight anyone that tells me that season 1 is one of the most beautiful animated shows, because the action is incredibly fluent. The character design and animation is gorgeous. The colors are beautiful. It flows so well. They have, I think, 3 times as many frames or something like that as any other Western show at the time. I often was of the impression that anime had more frames than Western animation. Usually looks like a more fluid kind of style than what we see in the West. But actually, they cut more corners than we do usually. And so they were essentially animating at like 4 times what they normally would for Korean and Japanese animation for this one season of the show. And so when it did get picked up for more seasons, they essentially said, we can't do that. We can't manage that anymore. And so they had to move to a different animation studio to work on the rest of Korra. And it's such a shame. I do not want to glorify the poor treatment that you go through to create something as good as Legend of Korra season 1. But it would be nice if we could put less strain on the animators, maybe just give it a longer creation time, but to create something as beautiful as that consistently.
I just hate the fact that you're saying this about a show that came out between 2012 to 2014, and roughly 10 years on, if not over, we're still having that conversation about it.
This might have been off air. We were talking about how these days it takes forever for new shows to come out, both animated and non-animated. And what was so remarkable about Korra is you had 4 seasons of pretty well animated and iffy writing, but generally pretty good writing of 4 seasons of animation in 2.5 years. There are shows now that have a hiatus between seasons of that long. You can understand now that they are treating their workers better. At least I hope so. I hope that this is the case. Workers are treated better to allow for quality in a reasonable time frame, to avoid crunch. I think that crunch still exists, but hopefully it is not to the extent that it was then.
Honestly, it is a shame, because you see that in a lot of creative industries nowadays, like especially with gaming, considering you and I keep up with that sphere. Hopefully going forward for the future of the Avatar series as well, that things will be better for that, but I suppose we'll see in time, won't we? Which is sad, but yeah, true. Not as sad as the end of season 3, mind you. But
No,
still.
we're going to see what Avatar Studios comes up with very soon. It's October, I believe, is when we're getting the first movie. And we haven't seen a single, like, there's not been any trailers or anything that have come out for it. And we're 8 months out, 7 months out from this movie coming out. And we've not really seen anything from it. So I both hope that they're still maintaining that timeline. I very much want to see it. But if it's going to take them longer to produce quality content, then we wait. It might just be that they're not ready to show trailer yet, that they're holding cards close to their chest. But I'm eager to find out what Avatar Studios has in store for us in October when it comes out. If you're listening to this in October after the movie's already come out and the impression's already in, then hopefully it's lived up to expectations.
Fingers crossed. Otherwise, we're going to have to put out a very lengthy statement of, we're sorry for encouraging you to go see that film. It wasn't as bad as the Shyamalan film, but
we can hope for sure. But we are intending to both watch it and to review it once we've watched it. So you'll be able to certainly hear our thoughts on it there.
can't wait for that, to be honest. It will be interesting to see another piece of, well, Avatar content that isn't live action or Netflix affiliated or Shyamalan affiliated, but of course that'll be next week's episode, and for legal reasons that unfortunately is not a joke. Next week, of course, we are going to be diving into that weird and not so wonderful world, which is a shame because, yeah, this is probably the last time we're going to be talking about good Avatar content until next week. So saying that note, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this wonderful series and, yeah, as you said, successor to The Last Airbender.
No, thank you so much for having me on. Just as I said in the Last Airbender episode, it's a pleasure to finally be able to talk about these series. It was a show that bonded us in university, and we are able to talk about it now over 10 years later. It's crazy that we're over a decade on from the conclusion of Korra, not even when we first watched it together.
I think it's even crazier the fact that we met 12 years ago So Avatar was one of the pillars of our friendship back then.
Avatar and Dragon Ball Abridged.
Yep, that is true.
Listen to our episode on Dragon Ball Abridged.
Yeah, definitely. Listen to it.
Makai Neko told me to go fuck myself.
For your apparently spicy views on Dragon Ball.
No, it was on Iron Man 3.
Iron Man 3, that was it. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I said I didn't like Iron Man 3, and he told me to fuck off.
And that's why we've not had an MCU month yet. We're too afraid of the backlash. No, in all seriousness, thank you so much for joining me this week to discuss Korra. And as I said, next week we'll be diving into the Shyamalan film. But as we go away and, build up the courage to go and watch that, to review it, where can these lovely Pandalorian listeners at home find your content?
These lovely listeners can find more of my content right here on Chatsunami. I've recorded many an episode with you now, including the previous Avatar, The Last Airbender episode, and just dozens of other fantastic topics and other themed months we've done together. They can also find me on my other podcast, Stop, Drop, and Roll Initiative. It's a Dungeons and Dragons podcast where myself, Satsunami, Robotic Battle Toaster, and wrestler Martin McAllister play through a D&D campaign. You can find that on all good podcast apps, Stop, Drop, and Roll Initiative, and at SDRIPod on Twitter. And you can find me at GreenShield95 on Twitter as well. But where can the lovely Pandalorians find your content and any other extras?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Andrew. If you want to check out more of our content together, of course, you'll know this, Andrew. I don't know why I say that like that. Yeah, if you want to check out more of our content, then you can find us on our website, chatsunami.com, as well as all good podcast apps. As always, I want to thank our amazing Pandalorian patrons, Robotic Battle Toaster, Sonia, Ghostie, and Cryptic1991. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Honestly, it means the world to us. But if you would like to become a Pandalorian patron and get exclusive access to early access episodes, special episodes that we've released, commentary tracks, and our fundraiser for getting Andrew's DVDs of Avatar The Last Airbender back, for legal reasons that last one's a joke.
I'm putting up wanted posters around Scotland.
Just drawn by yourself.
Like Sokka when he draws
Yeah.
that Nappa wanted poster.
Yeah. Then you can check that out at our Patreon page, patreon.com/Chatsunami. This podcast is also a member of the Podpack Collective. For more information, please check us out at our Twitter/X handle, Podpack Collect. But until next time, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. Stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, stay hydrated.
What a band.
What a drive.